Hello, dear listener. Before we begin today's beautiful love story, I want to send a special shout out to three hearts who are always here with us. Alicia Muhammad from Trinidad, Angie Sullivan from Las Vegas, and Joyce Cram from Toronto. Your comments light up this channel like stars in the midnight sky. And what about you? Where are you listening from right now? Tell me in the comments, your country, your city. I read every message with care, and who knows, maybe your name will be featured in the next video. Now then, let's begin today's story. The sharp click of a closing door cut through the muffled symphony of the gala, plunging the world into darkness. The air, thick with the clean scent of laundry starch and a faint electric tang of panic, was suddenly impossible to breathe. April Collins was pressed against the cold, unyielding metal of industrial shelving, her own breath trapped in her lungs. A solid, warm body was flush against her back, and she could feel the frantic, wild hammering of a heart against her shoulder blade. It was the heart of Miles Whitmore. Just outside the door, a woman's voice, sharp and imperious as shattering glass, sliced through the hallway. "Miles, I know you're hiding. Your grandfather is waiting." How had this happened? 30 minutes ago, April's world had been simple, if stressful. Her universe had consisted of balancing a precarious tray of champagne flutes, navigating the glittering ballroom of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, a job she'd taken for some desperately needed extra cash. That's when she had seen him, Miles Whitmore, the billionaire owner of the very hotel she stood in, and, in a strange twist of fate, a regular at the small diner where she worked her main job. There, he was just Miles, the quiet man who always sat at the counter, ordered black coffee, and treated her with a gentle, unassuming kindness that was the highlight of her often grueling shifts. He had spotted her from across the ballroom, a vast sea of tuxedos and jewels separating them. A small secret smile had touched his lips, a silent acknowledgement just for her. But the smile had vanished in an instant. A formidable older woman with the posture of a drill sergeant and the eyes of a hawk had intercepted him. April recognized her from society pages, Genevieve Whitmore, his aunt. Beside her, navigating the crowd in a sleek motorized wheelchair, was the patriarch himself, Arthur Whitmore. His face was a mask of stone as Genevieve gestured animatedly toward a young, vapid-looking heiress. The tension radiating from the family trio was a palpable force. It was then that Miles's eyes, a deep, startling blue, had found hers again. The look in them was no longer a shared secret. It was a desperate, silent plea for rescue. Before she could even process it, he was moving. He crossed the ballroom with a long-legged, purposeful stride, grabbed her hand, his grip firm and shockingly desperate, and pulled her along with him, yanking open the first door he saw. The utility closet. And now, here they were. The footsteps in the hallway finally faded, and the sharp voice was gone. Miles let out a shuddering breath of relief, the sound loud in the cramped darkness. He took a step back, giving her space, and even in the pitch black, she could feel the intensity of his gaze on her. "I need a favor," he whispered, his voice a raw, strained rasp. "A favor I have absolutely no right to ask." Before she could form a single question, the closet door was thrown open. Light and music flooded the small space, blinding her. Miles didn't hesitate. There was no time for explanation. He grabbed her hand again, pulling her out of the closet and directly into the path of his approaching family. His aunt and grandfather stopped short, their faces a mixture of shock and disapproval. Then, he did the unthinkable. He cupped her face in his hands, his expression a mask of fierce determination, and he kissed her. It wasn't a quick, frantic peck. It was a deliberate, cinematic, soul-stealing kiss. It was deep and possessive, designed to be seen, to make a statement. The world around April dissolved into a dizzying blur of light and sound. The murmuring of the crowd, the distant music, his aunt's gasp, it all faded to nothing. There was only the firm, warm pressure of his lips on hers and the scent of expensive cologne and clean cotton that was uniquely him. When he finally, slowly, pulled away, she was breathless, her mind a complete blank. He didn't let her go. His arm snaked around her waist, anchoring her to his side in a gesture of undeniable ownership. He didn't look at her. His gaze was fixed over her head, a direct, defiant challenge aimed at his grandfather. In the stunned silence that had fallen over the ballroom, his voice rang out, clear and firm. "Grandfather, Aunt Genevieve, I'd like you to meet April." He paused, his grip tightening on her waist. "My girlfriend." Genevieve's face contorted into a mask of barely contained fury. Arthur Whitmore's expression was as unreadable as ancient stone. April's heart stopped. In the space of a single, stolen kiss, her simple life had just been detonated. She was now the fake girlfriend of a billionaire, a pawn in a high-stakes family war she didn't understand, and she had just been introduced to the most powerful man in the city. The world returned to April in jarring, fragmented pieces. The murmur of the crowd, the clinking of glasses, the cold fury in Genevieve's eyes. She was still pressed against Miles's side, his arm a band of steel around her waist. She felt like a prop, a beautifully presented piece of evidence in a trial she hadn't known she was attending. The rest of the evening passed in a surreal haze. Miles didn't let her go. He guided her through the glittering crowd, introducing her to people whose names she instantly forgot. He was a masterful actor, playing the part of the devoted boyfriend with a terrifying conviction. But beneath the charming smiles and the proprietary touches, she could feel the tension humming through him. He was a tightly coiled spring. It wasn't until hours later, when he had escorted her home and dismissed his driver, that they were truly alone. He followed her up to her small apartment, the silence between them heavy and suffocating. Now she sat on her own worn-out sofa, still in her simple black waitress uniform, the apron crumpled in her lap. The contrast between her reality and the scene at the gala was a dizzying chasm. Miles sat opposite her in her only armchair, looking like a caged panther in the small space. On the coffee table between them lay a sleek black leather folder. It felt like a bomb. "The future of my family's empire," Miles began, his voice low and heavy with a weariness that went beyond mere exhaustion, "is worth, to me, $1 million. April's breath hitched. The number was so astronomical it didn't feel real. He leaned forward, the mask of the charming boyfriend gone, replaced by a man bearing an immense weight. He explained the situation, his words precise and grim. His grandfather, Arthur, was dying. His health was failing rapidly, and in his will, a document that controlled the fate of a multi-billion-dollar global enterprise, was a stability clause. To inherit the chairmanship and protect the company from being dismantled, Miles had to prove he was a stable, settled man. He needed to be in a serious, committed relationship. If he failed, control would pass to his aunt, Genevieve. "She would sell the company for parts," he said, a bitter edge to his voice. "She sees it as a collection of assets. My grandfather and my father saw it as a legacy, a responsibility. But why me?" April whispered, the question she'd been screaming in her own mind for hours. He looked at her, and for a moment, the hardness in his eyes softened. "Because my grandfather, for all his faults, is a brilliant judge of character. He despises the sycophants and the social climbers my aunt surrounds herself with. He values authenticity above all else." He paused, his gaze intense. "And you, April, are the most genuinely real person I have met in a very long time. Your kindness at the diner, it's not a performance. He will see that. He will believe you." The proposal was laid bare. She would be his girlfriend, his proof of stability. In return, he would pay for her college education, settle her family's crushing medical debts, and give her the $1 million. It was a golden key, a solution to every problem that kept her awake at night. Her first instinct was to say no. The scale of the deception, the cold, transactional nature of it. It was terrifying. It felt wrong. She was about to form the word, to push the folder back across the table and run. Then her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. It was her younger sister, Lily. With a trembling hand, she answered. "Lily, what's wrong?" "They're going to kick me out," Lily sobbed into the phone, her voice choked with panic. "The university." The tuition payment was due. and they said there are no more extensions. I have to leave by the end of the week. The world tilted on its axis. Lily's dream of becoming a teacher, the dream their whole family had sacrificed for, was about to be extinguished. April's heart felt like it was being squeezed in a vice. She looked up from the phone, her eyes meeting Miles's. He had heard everything. His expression was unreadable, but he didn't look away. Caught between the impossible lie and the unbearable reality, there was no choice. There was only necessity. "I'll do it," she whispered, her voice hoarse. A flicker of relief crossed his face, quickly masked. He pushed the leather folder toward her. The contract. Her hands shook as she opened it. It was dense with legal jargon, but one clause near the end stood out, stark and chilling. Article 7. Emotional prohibitions. The contracted party, April Collins, agrees for the duration of this agreement to never initiate a verbal declaration of romantic love, e.g., "I love you," toward the primary party, Miles Whitmore. A violation of this rule, regardless of context or intent, will result in the immediate and irrevocable termination of this contract and the forfeiture of all future financial compensation. She read it again, the words blurring, her breath caught in her chest. It was a gag order on the heart. What kind of rule is this?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Miles leaned back, his face becoming a cold, distant mask. The warmth she thought she'd seen was gone, replaced by a chilling remoteness. "It's the only rule that matters," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You can pretend to be charmed by me. You can pretend to desire me. You can pretend to like me, but you will not pretend to love me. That is a line we will not cross." He stared at her, his blue eyes like chips of ice. "Are we understood?" Trapped, with her sister's desperate sobs still echoing in her ear and a rule that felt like a shard of glass aimed at her soul, April picked up the pen. Her signature was a shaky, uncertain scrawl, the ink sealing a deal with a man who demanded a counterfeit heart, but was terrified of a real one. The reflection staring back at April was a stranger. She stood in the guest suite of Miles's penthouse, a room larger than her entire apartment, wearing a simple, elegant forest green dress he had provided. The fabric was silk, whispering against her skin with a soft, foreign language of luxury. But beneath the expensive facade, she felt like a fraud, a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. Her heart was a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs. The door to her suite opened, and Miles stepped in. He was dressed in a dark suit, no tie, the top button of his crisp white shirt undone. He looked impossibly handsome, a portrait of casual power. The faint, familiar scent of his cologne, sandalwood and clean cotton, filled the space, a scent she now associated with panic and a terrifying, magnetic pull. "Ready to meet the lions?" he asked, his voice laced with a dark, humorless irony. She could only manage a weak nod. This was their first official test as a couple, an intimate family dinner at the Whitmore mansion. The mansion was an imposing fortress of stone and ivy, a place where history and money had settled deep into the foundations. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of beeswax and old secrets. Genevieve greeted them at the door, her smile as thin and sharp as a razor's edge. But it was Arthur Whitmore who commanded the room, even from his wheelchair. He was parked near a grand, unlit fireplace, a tartan blanket over his knees. His eyes, a paler, more faded blue than his grandson's, were sharp and missed nothing. The dinner was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Genevieve, playing the part of the gracious hostess, subjected April to a relentless, veiled interrogation. "So, April," she began, her fork poised delicately over a piece of asparagus, "Miles tells us you work at a diner. How charmingly rustic. And what does your family do?" "My mother is a nurse," April replied, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Ah, a noble profession," Genevieve said, with an inflection that made it sound like the exact opposite. "It must be so difficult with the long hours. I imagine you don't get to see her much." It was a subtle dig, a test to see if April's backstory was consistent. Throughout the ordeal, Arthur remained silent, his gaze moving from April to Miles and back again, his expression unreadable. He was observing, judging. April felt like a butterfly pinned to a board. The main attack came with the dessert. "Miles has always had such a passion for the arts," Genevieve remarked to the table at large. "I remember how he adored the opera we saw last season. La Traviata, wasn't it, darling? You must tell us, April. What was your favorite part of the performance he took you to?" It was a perfectly laid trap. Genevieve knew, with the certainty of her class, that a girl who worked in a diner had likely never set foot in an opera house. April's mind went blank. The silence stretched. She could feel Genevieve's triumphant smirk, could feel Arthur's penetrating gaze on her. She was about to stammer, to confess, to fail. "Actually, Aunt," Miles' voice cut in, smooth as velvet. He reached across the table and took April's hand, his thumb stroking the back of it. "April finds the opera a bit stuffy. Her tastes are more authentic." He turned his charming smile on April, his eyes communicating a clear message. "Follow my lead." "I was just telling her the other day," he continued, his voice warm with a fabricated nostalgia, "that nothing will ever top that first night I took her to that little jazz club downtown. The Blue Note. Remember, darling. The air was thick with smoke, the bourbon was cheap, and an old man was playing the most heartbreakingly beautiful saxophone solo. You were so captivated you didn't even touch your drink." He described the fictional night with such vivid, intimate detail, the way she had supposedly looked in the dim, blue light, the specific song the saxophonist had played, a quiet joke he'd whispered in her ear, that for a dizzying moment, April almost believed it herself. It was a place he knew she would love, a memory crafted just for her. He had not only saved her from the trap, he had painted a picture of a relationship so real, so grounded in shared, authentic moments, that it made Genevieve's talk of the opera seem shallow and pretentious by comparison. Across the table, for the first time all night, the corner of Arthur Whitmore's stern mouth lifted in the barest hint of a smile. Later, as they were preparing to leave, Arthur beckoned April closer. Miles hesitated, but his grandfather waved him away. "I wish to speak with the girl, alone." April approached the wheelchair, her heart pounding. The old man's eyes, though faded, were piercing. He studied her for a long, silent moment. "My grandson is a good man," Arthur said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "But he is a fool in many ways, blinded by the past. I hope you, girl, have more sense than he does." The words were not a threat, but they weren't a blessing either. They were a warning, an enigmatic challenge. April felt a chill run down her spine. She hadn't just passed a test. She had been recruited into a much older, much more dangerous game. The next few days were a blur of logistics. April was moving into the penthouse. It was a necessary part of the charade, a way to present a united front. She packed up her life in a series of cardboard boxes, the process feeling less like a move and more like an erasure of her old self. Her small, sunlit apartment, with its peeling paint and mismatched furniture, had been her sanctuary. The sterile, silent luxury of Miles's penthouse felt like a beautiful prison. She was taping up the last box when a knock echoed on her door. It was Miles. He looked utterly out of place in her modest hallway, his expensive suit a stark contrast to the worn-out welcome mat. The scent of sandalwood and clean cotton preceded him into the room. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, the excuse so flimsy it was almost transparent. "Thought I'd see if you needed help with any of the heavy lifting." He stepped inside, his gaze sweeping over the space. It was the first time he had been here since the night he'd made his proposal. He seemed to notice everything. The stack of art history books on her nightstand, the faded photographs of her and her sister, Lily, taped to the refrigerator, the charcoal sketches pinned to a corkboard on the wall. He was seeing the architecture of her life, the parts of her that had nothing to do with the contract. "You're a talented artist," he said, his voice quiet as he studied a sketch of an old woman's hands. "I just doodle," she replied, a flush creeping up her neck. The tension of the family dinner had dissipated, replaced by an easy, almost comfortable quiet. They talked as he helped her label a few boxes, the conversation drifting away from the high-stakes game they were playing. For a few precious minutes, they weren't a billionaire and his fake girlfriend. They were just a man and a woman, sharing a moment in a sun-drenched, half-empty room. The peaceful bubble was popped by the sound of a key in the lock. The door swung open, and April's younger sister, Lily, bounced in, her face bright with a smile. "Surprise! I finished my classes early and thought I'd help you." Lily stopped short, her eyes widening as she took in the sight of the impossibly handsome, well-dressed man standing in her sister's living room. "Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize you had company." "Lily, this is Miles," April said, her heart starting to pound. Lily's eyes lit up. "Miles? The Miles?" she whispered excitedly to April, before turning a dazzling smile on him. "It's so nice to finally meet my sister's mystery boyfriend. She talks about you. Well, she doesn't, which is how I knew it was serious." Before April could die of mortification, Lily was suddenly seized by a harsh, racking cough. It was a sound April knew all too well. The cough deepened, becoming a desperate, wheezing fight for air. "Asthma. Lily? Your inhaler?" April asked, her voice sharp with panic. Lily shook her head, her eyes wide with fear, pointing to her empty backpack. She had forgotten it. In the space of a heartbeat, Miles transformed. The quiet observer vanished, replaced by a man of decisive, immediate action. He didn't ask questions. He didn't hesitate. He crossed the room, scooped the gasping Lily into his arms as if she weighed nothing, and turned to April. "Which hospital is closest?" he commanded, his voice calm and authoritative. He carried her down the stairs and placed her gently in the back of his car. He drove with a focused, controlled speed, breaking a dozen traffic laws without a single wasted motion. At the emergency room, he swept through the bureaucracy, his name and his presence parting the waters of waiting lists and paperwork. He ensured Lily was seen immediately, that she had the best care, that a new, top-of-the-line inhaler was waiting for her before she was even discharged. Hours later, they sat in the sterile quiet of the waiting room while Lily rested. April was wrapped in a state of shock. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "You didn't have to do any of that." Miles turned to look at her, his face serious, the cool mask of control gone. In its place was an unguarded intensity that made her breath catch. "Yes, I did," he said, his voice low and rough. He looked down at his own hands, a flicker of confusion crossing his face, as if he were surprised by his own actions. His fierce, protective instinct had completely overridden the cold logic of their contract. He had acted not as a man fulfilling a business arrangement, but as something else entirely, something real. And the realization seemed to shake him to his very core. The annual Whitmore Hospital Charity Ball was the glittering apex of the city's social calendar. For April, it was the highest, most terrifying stage she had yet been forced to occupy. Dressed in a midnight blue gown that shimmered with every movement, another selection from Miles's seemingly endless resources, she felt less like a guest and more like a carefully curated exhibit. Her hair was swept up. Delicate diamond earrings, on loan, she kept reminding herself, brushed against her neck, and her heart hammered a frantic rhythm against her ribs. "You look breathtaking," Miles murmured as he met her at the top of the grand staircase. He offered his arm, his touch sending a familiar jolt through her. His eyes, however, held a new depth, a warmth that lingered from the night at the hospital. The line between them had been redrawn. Their entrance caused a ripple of whispers. This was it, the public debut. Flashbulbs popped, heads turned. April felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on her and instinctively moved closer to Miles. His arm tightened around her, a silent, solid promise of protection. He guided her onto the dance floor for the opening waltz. The orchestra swelled, and he pulled her into his arms. The formal posture of the dance was a sanctioned excuse for a proximity they both secretly craved. His hand rested firmly on the small of her back, his other hand enveloping hers. They moved together as one, a perfect, synchronized unit. "Just follow my lead," he whispered, his lips brushing against her ear. "You're a natural." For the duration of the song, the world fell away. There was no contract, no prying eyes, no devastating rule. There was only the music, the warmth of his hand, and the hypnotic intensity of his gaze. He looked at her not as a business partner, but as a man looks at a woman he desires. The performance was so flawless it ceased to feel like one. From a table near the edge of the dance floor, Genevieve watched them, her eyes narrowed into slits, a hawk observing its prey. She saw the way April relaxed in his arms, the way Miles's thumb caressed the back of her hand. She saw the chemistry, and it fueled her cold fury. After the dance, as the applause faded, Miles kept her hand in his. "Let's get some air," he said, his voice low. He guided her through a set of glass doors and onto a secluded stone terrace, away from the noise and the suffocating scrutiny. The cool night air was a welcome relief. The terrace was dark, lit only by the distant glow of the city and the faint moonlight. Below them, a manicured garden slept in shadow. "Just for a moment," he whispered, turning to face her. "Let's forget we're being watched." He didn't release her hand. Instead, he used it to gently pull her closer. The space between them, once a chasm of formality and rules, was now a fragile, humming thread of tension. He raised his other hand, his fingers hesitating for a fraction of a second before gently tucking a stray curl behind her ear. His touch was feather light, but it sent a fire racing across her skin. "April," he breathed, his voice thick with an emotion he could no longer conceal. And then, under the pale moonlight, he kissed her. It was nothing like the desperate public statement of their first kiss. This was slow, tender. It was a question and an answer all in one. His lips were soft, moving against hers with a gentle, searching pressure. It was a kiss full of unspoken things, of gratitude for her strength, of admiration for her spirit, of a deep, undeniable longing that had been building since the first day he saw her. She responded instinctively, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, feeling the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath the fine fabric of his tuxedo. This was real. This was terrifyingly, beautifully real. The kiss ended, but he didn't move away. He rested his forehead against hers, their breaths mingling in the cool night air. She was drowning in the scent of him, in the feeling of him. Her heart felt too big for her chest, overflowing with an emotion so powerful, so overwhelming, it demanded to be spoken. "Miles," she began, the two words she was forbidden to say burning on the tip of her tongue. "I love you." He flinched as if she had struck him. He pulled back, his hands gripping her shoulders, and a look of sheer panic flashed in his eyes. He placed a single finger gently against her lips, silencing her. "Don't," he pleaded, his voice a raw, desperate whisper. "Please, April, don't say it." The unspoken words died on her lips, turning to ash in her mouth. The rule. The cold, cruel, devastating rule. It slammed down between them like a wall of ice, shattering the beautiful, fragile moment into a million pieces. He wanted her heart, but he was terrified of its name. The aftermath of the stolen kiss was a new kind of silence. It wasn't the awkward quiet of strangers, or the tense silence of a business arrangement. It was the pained, frustrated silence of two people who had tasted a moment of truth only to have it snatched away by a self-imposed prison. They tiptoed around each other, the memory of the kiss a ghost that haunted the space between them. A week later, Miles hosted a private reception at a chic downtown art gallery to court a potential investor. He insisted April attend. "My grandfather expects to see you by my side," he'd said, his tone carefully neutral, but his eyes held a different story. April was in her element. For the first time, she wasn't just a prop. She moved through the gallery with a genuine passion, discussing brushstrokes and color theory with an infectious enthusiasm that charmed everyone she spoke to. She had even brought her personal portfolio, a slim leather case containing her best charcoal sketches, hoping to gather the courage to show it to the gallery's curator. She was standing before a large, abstract canvas, lost in thought, when a familiar, chilling voice spoke from beside her. "You clean up nicely, dear." It was Genevieve. She held a glass of red wine, her smile as thin and sharp as a shard of glass. But the stain of the diner never truly washes out, does it? April stiffened, but refused to give her the satisfaction of a reaction. I'm not ashamed of where I work, Genevieve. Of course not, his aunt replied, her voice dripping with false sweetness. It takes a certain ambition to leap from serving coffee to sleeping in a billionaire's penthouse. A commendable, if transparent, trajectory. Genevieve shadowed her for the rest of the evening, a beautifully dressed vulture circling its prey. She made cutting remarks just loud enough for April to hear, questioned her opinions on art with condescending amusement, and did everything in her power to undermine her confidence. April felt her composure beginning to fray, the joy she'd felt moments before slowly curdling into anxiety. Then Genevieve made her move. April was speaking with the curator, a kind, older woman who had shown genuine interest in her work. "I'd love to see your sketches sometime," the curator said. "Actually, I have them with me," April replied, her heart leaping with a nervous excitement. As she turned to retrieve her portfolio from a nearby table, Genevieve, who had been passing by, stumbled. It was a theatrical, perfectly executed stumble. The glass of red wine in her hand tilted, its dark crimson contents arcing through the air and splashing directly onto the closed leather portfolio. "Oh my heavens!" Genevieve cried, her hand flying to her mouth in mock horror. "How clumsy of me! I am so terribly sorry." April stared, frozen, as the dark liquid seeped into the seams of the case. With trembling fingers, she fumbled with the latch and opened it. It was a massacre. The wine had bled through the protective sheets, staining her delicate charcoal sketches. Faces were smeared into grotesque masks, intricate landscapes blurred into meaningless smudges. Years of work, hours of passion, the very best pieces of her soul were ruined. A strangled sob escaped her lips. She couldn't breathe. She didn't see Miles cross the room. She only felt his presence as he suddenly appeared at her side. He took in the scene in a single sweeping glance. The ruined portfolio, April's devastated, tear-streaked face, and his aunt's feigned look of concern. A terrifying glacial calm settled over his features. The charming host, the conflicted lover, both vanished. In their place was the cold, ruthless man who ran an empire. He walked to his aunt, his movements slow and deliberate. He stopped directly in front of her, his voice a low, deadly whisper that only she and April could hear. "You have just crossed a line from which there is no return." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The menace in his tone was absolute. He turned his back on her, his face instantly transforming as his eyes landed on April. The fury was gone, replaced by a deep, aching concern that made her heart twist. He gently closed the ruined portfolio, his hand covering hers. "Let's go home," he said softly. The ride back to the penthouse was silent, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the heavy, charged quiet of shared fury and unspoken comfort. Miles's hand rested on the seat between them, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from it. His jaw was a tight, hard line, his knuckles white where he gripped his own knee. Back in the vast, sterile living room, the dam of April's composure finally broke. She sank onto the plush white sofa, opened the portfolio again, and stared at the ruined pages. A fresh wave of grief washed over her, and she began to sob, deep, ragged, heartbroken sobs for the lost hours, for the violation, for the piece of her soul that had been so casually destroyed. "It was all I had," she cried, the words muffled by her hands. "The only thing that was truly mine." Miles stood by the window watching her, his posture rigid with a helpless rage. He was a man accustomed to solving any problem with a phone call or a check. He could buy her 1,000 new portfolios, 1,000,000 sheets of the finest paper, but he couldn't undo this. He couldn't fix the wound, only witness the bleeding. Slowly, he walked over and sat beside her on the sofa. He didn't offer platitudes. He didn't tell her it would be okay. He just sat there, a solid, silent presence in her storm of grief. He let her cry, his proximity a quiet testament of support. He validated her pain simply by being there, by letting it be real and important. After a long time, her sobs subsided into shaky, exhausted breaths. He still hadn't said a word. Then he stood up and walked into his private study. He was gone for several minutes. When he returned, he was holding something in his hands. It was an old leather-bound sketchbook, its cover worn smooth with time and use. The corners were scuffed, and on the front, 2 simple initials were embossed in faded gold: D.W. He sat down beside her again and gently placed the sketchbook in her lap. "It was my father's," he said, his voice low and rough with an emotion she had never heard from him before. He wasn't a businessman, not really. He was an architect, an artist. He loved drawing more than anything. April looked up at him, her eyes wide and questioning. "He gave this to me when I was a teenager," Miles continued, his gaze fixed on the old book. "He told me that buildings, companies, empires, they can all turn to dust, but art comes from the soul, and the soul is indestructible." He finally lifted his eyes to meet hers, his expression achingly sincere. "Your soul wasn't stained tonight, April. Only the paper." He gently pushed the sketchbook toward her. "Start again," he said softly. "Right here. I will give you anything you need. A studio, supplies, all the time in the world. I'll cancel meetings. I'll rearrange my entire schedule, whatever it takes." He paused, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "I believe in you." The gift was so much more than an old book. It was a piece of his history, a part of his own heart. It was a promise. It was a vote of faith from a man who lived in a world of transactions. It was the most profound, personal, and meaningful gesture he could have possibly made. April stared at him, her heart swelling with an emotion so powerful, so overwhelming, it felt like it might tear her apart. It was gratitude. It was admiration. It was a deep, earth-shattering love. The forbidden words rose in her throat, a desperate, unstoppable tide. "Miles, She stopped, her breath catching. The rule. The cold, cruel contract. It was a physical barrier, a gag in her mouth. How could she not say it? How could she sit here, holding a piece of his father's soul in her hands, and not tell him the truth of her own? The silence that fell was agonizing, filled with the deafening sound of the one thing she was forbidden to say. Arthur Whitmore, with the cunning of a seasoned chess master, made his next move. Citing a brief, unexpected improvement in his health, he suggested a family weekend on the Whitmore yacht, the Legacy. It was a summons, not an invitation. The intention was clear: to trap them all in the claustrophobic luxury of the open sea, to observe his warring heirs under pressure. The yacht was a floating palace, a marvel of mahogany and brass that cut through the waves with silent, arrogant power. But for April, it felt like a gilded cage. The proximity to Genevieve was a constant, low-grade stress. His aunt treated her with a frigid, contemptuous politeness that was somehow more insulting than open hostility. She was a constant, smiling threat. But away from Genevieve's venomous gaze, the forced closeness with Miles was a different kind of torture. A sweet, agonizing one. They found stolen moments of peace on the sun-drenched decks, their conversations a quiet rebellion against the tension that permeated the rest of the vessel. One night, long after Arthur and Genevieve had retired, they stood together at the yacht's stern, the dark water churning below them. A canopy of brilliant, unfamiliar stars glittered in the moonless sky, a sight April had never seen from the light-polluted city. "I've never seen so many," she whispered, her voice full of awe. "My father used to bring me out here," Miles said, his voice a low murmur beside her. He was leaning on the railing, his silhouette dark against the star-dusted horizon. He'd point out the constellations. He said it was important to remember how small we are, that our empires and our arguments are meaningless out here. The confession was quiet, personal. He was sharing another piece of himself, another crack in the armor. She saw not the billionaire, but the boy who missed his father. "He sounds like he was a wonderful man," she said softly. "He was," Miles replied, a note of raw grief in his voice that he rarely let show. He turned to look at her, his face half-shadowed, half-lit by the dim deck lights. "He would have liked you. You have the same clarity. You see things for what they are." The compliment, so simple and sincere, made her heart ache. In the quiet intimacy of the night, surrounded by the vast, dark ocean, the artifice of their arrangement felt absurd. They were just two people, sharing their vulnerabilities under the stars. He took a half-step closer, the space between them shrinking. The scent of the salt air mingled with his cologne. He looked out at the dark water, then back at her, his expression unreadable, but intense. "You know, April," he began, his voice hesitant, searching. "When I'm with you, I feel like I can—" He stopped, the words catching in his throat. He looked away, a flicker of frustration, or was it fear, crossing his face. The sentence, so full of promise, died, unfinished. He had been about to say something real, something from the heart. "I feel like I can breathe. I feel like myself. I feel like I can be happy." She didn't know what the words would have been, but she knew they would have been true. And he had swallowed them. The habit of a lifetime, of control, of emotional suppression, of fear, had silenced him. The moment was gone. The connection fractured. April felt a sharp, new kind of pain. It wasn't just about the rule he had imposed on her anymore. It was about the rules he lived by himself, the walls he couldn't seem to tear down, even when he wanted to. She realized, with a sinking heart, that as long as he was a prisoner of his own past, she would always be one too. Without a word, she turned and walked back toward the cabin, leaving him alone with the stars and his unspoken truth. The weekend at sea did little to calm the stormy family dynamics. If anything, it sharpened the edges of their conflict. 2 days after they returned, Arthur Whitmore's health took a sudden, drastic turn for the worse. The brief rally had been just that, brief. His doctors were clear. His time was no longer measured in weeks, but in days. He summoned them all to his study in the mansion. It was a somber, wood-paneled room that smelled of old books and mortality. The family lawyers were present, their faces grim and neutral. April stood slightly behind Miles, her hand resting lightly on the back of his chair, a silent, steadfast presence. This was it, the final judgment. Genevieve, dressed in a severe black suit, spoke first. She was prepared. She presented a thick, meticulously compiled dossier detailing every one of Miles's perceived failures. His playboy past, his reckless business decisions, his unstable personal life. She argued with cold, corporate precision that she was the only logical, stable choice to lead the company into the future. The Whitmore legacy requires a steady hand, not the whims of a man who is clearly still finding his way, she concluded, casting a pointed, venomous look at April. When it was his turn, Miles spoke not of his past, but of his vision. He spoke with a quiet, burning passion about honoring his father's and grandfather's legacy, not by stagnating, but by innovating. He spoke of responsibility to their employees, of sustainable growth. He was no longer the conflicted man from the yacht. He was a leader, confident and clear-eyed. April felt a swell of pride so fierce it almost brought tears to her eyes. When he finished, Arthur sat in silence for a long moment, his breathing shallow. His gaze moved from his son to his grandson, and then, to everyone's surprise, it settled on April. He ignored the lawyers, the dossier, the passionate speeches. He pinned her with his pale, piercing eyes. "Girl," he rasped, his voice weak but still commanding. "One question." The room fell into a dead silence. Every eye was on her. Miles tensed, a protective instinct making him want to shield her, but he knew he couldn't. This was Arthur's game. "Do you love my grandson?" The question dropped into the silent room like a grenade. It was a masterfully cruel, brilliant trap. A simple yes or no was all he wanted, but either answer was a detonation. If she said yes, she would be telling the truth of her own heart. but she would be violating the primary clause of her contract with Miles. In his mind, it would prove she was just an actress playing a part for money, confirming his deepest fears about love being a transaction. He would never trust her again. If she said no, she would be destroying the entire foundation of their charade. She would be handing Genevieve the victory on a silver platter, proving Miles's relationship was a sham and that he was, as his aunt claimed, unstable and deceitful. Her mind raced. Miles's future, the legacy of his family, her own integrity, it all balanced on the razor's edge of her answer. She could feel Miles's panic, a palpable wave from the man sitting beside her. She could feel Genevieve's triumphant, predatory stillness. April held the old man's gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The fate of an empire rested on her next words. The silence in the study was absolute, so heavy it felt hard to breathe. April could feel the weight of every gaze in the room, but she kept her eyes locked on Arthur Whitmore. She saw the cunning in his tired eyes, the final, ruthless test of a king choosing his heir. He wasn't just asking about her feelings. He was testing her character, her intelligence, her loyalty. She took a slow, steadying breath, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "Mr. Whitmore," she began, her voice clear and firm, betraying none of the frantic turmoil in her heart. "What I feel for your grandson is not a single word. It's not a yes or a no that can be spoken to satisfy a clause in a will or win a boardroom battle." She felt Miles shift beside her, a small, sharp intake of breath. Genevieve leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowed, sensing a trick. April continued, her gaze unwavering. "Feelings are complicated, but actions are simple. They are true." She paused, letting her words sink in. "I have seen the weight of the world on his shoulders, and I have seen him carry it with a strength he doesn't even know he has. I have seen him be kind when no one was watching, and I have seen him fight for what he believes in when everyone was. What I can tell you, with absolute certainty, is that I choose to stand beside him. I choose him. Today, tomorrow, and whatever comes after. Whether he is the chairman of this company or just the man I know." She finally broke eye contact with Arthur and turned her head, her gaze finding Miles's. Her look was full of a fierce, unwavering loyalty that went far beyond any contract. "That," she finished softly, speaking now only to him, "is more important than any 3 words I could say." It was brilliant. A masterstroke of emotional and logical genius. She had not said "I love you," and therefore had not violated the contract. But she had declared, in no uncertain terms, a loyalty and a commitment so profound that it was more powerful than any simple confession of love. She had answered the spirit of the question, not the letter, and in doing so, had proven herself to be exactly the kind of person Arthur Whitmore valued. Someone who understood that true strength lay not in words, but in conviction. A slow, genuine, and deeply satisfied smile spread across Arthur's tired face. He had found his answer. "That," the old man rasped, his voice filled with a sudden, surprising strength, "is the answer of a Whitmore." He turned his head toward his stunned lawyers. "You have my decision. Prepare the final documents. The chairmanship goes to Miles." A strangled sound of outrage escaped Genevieve's lips. She looked as if she had been physically struck. Miles was staring at April, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated awe. He was looking at her as if seeing her for the first time, not as a waitress, not as a fake girlfriend, but as his brilliant, fierce, and astonishing equal. In the euphoric chaos that followed, as the lawyers began shuffling papers and Genevieve stormed out of the room, Miles reached for her, pulling her into a tight, desperate hug. "You did it, April," he whispered into her hair, his voice thick with gratitude and disbelief. "We did it." She hugged him back, but a cold, hollow feeling was spreading through her chest. She had helped him win his empire. She had secured his future. But in crafting the perfect, rule-abiding answer, she had been forced to confront the bleak reality of her own situation. Her future with him would always be governed by a contract. Her heart would always be bound by a clause that forbade her from speaking her own truth. The victory felt strangely, devastatingly, like a loss. The victory celebration was a muted, somber affair. Miles was officially the heir, but the triumph was overshadowed by the impending loss of his grandfather. He was consumed by meetings, by the immense task of transition, and by a quiet, personal grief. April, meanwhile, felt like a ghost haunting the edges of his new reality. She had played her part to perfection, and now the curtain had fallen. She wandered through the silent, magnificent penthouse, a space that had never once felt like home. She found herself in the spare room that Miles had, without her asking, converted into a small art studio for her. It was filled with the best supplies money could buy, professional-grade canvases, a dizzying array of paints, and charcoal sticks of every texture. It was a beautiful, thoughtful cage. She sat on the stool, staring at a blank canvas. She had everything she needed to create, but her heart was empty. The promise he had made, "I believe in you," echoed in her mind, a painful reminder of a connection that now felt impossibly distant. She had helped him secure his world, but she had lost herself in the process. She couldn't live like this anymore. She couldn't be the woman who stood by his side but was forbidden from speaking the truth of her own heart. With a quiet, resolute sadness, she made her decision. She took a piece of thick, cream-colored stationery from his desk, the same kind he had used for his promise to her. Her hand was steady as she wrote. She did not break the rule, not even at the end. She did not write of love. She wrote of truth. "Miles, you have your empire. You fought for it, and you won. I am so incredibly proud of the man I've seen you become. Now I need to find my own world. I cannot live in one where the most important truths are forbidden. I cannot be the person you need me to be while being silenced. This isn't goodbye out of anger, but out of necessity. For both of us. Thank you for everything, April." She folded the note and left it on the center of his perfectly made bed, a stark white rectangle against the dark gray duvet. She packed a single small bag with only the essentials, a few clothes, her wallet, and the old worn leather sketchbook his father had owned. It was the only thing in this entire world of wealth that she felt truly belonged to her. She walked out of the penthouse, the quiet click of the door echoing the sound of her own heart breaking. She didn't look back. Miles found the note hours later. He had just come from the hospital, his mind numb with grief and exhaustion. The victory over his aunt felt hollow, meaningless. He saw the note, and a cold dread washed over him before he even touched it. He read the words, and the floor seemed to drop out from under him. The carefully constructed world he had just won shattered into dust. The rule. The stupid, cowardly rule he had created to protect himself from a past pain had just cost him his entire future. It hadn't been a shield. It had been a cage, and it had driven her away. At that exact moment, his phone rang. It was the hospital. "Mr. Whitmore, I'm so sorry. Your grandfather passed away just a few minutes ago. He went peacefully in his sleep." The news landed not with a bang, but with a quiet, devastating finality. He had inherited everything. He was the undisputed king of his empire, and he had never, in his entire life, felt so utterly alone. He dropped the note and ran through the penthouse, his heart pounding with a desperate, frantic panic. He called her name in the empty rooms. He dialed her number, his hands shaking. It went straight to voicemail. Her voice, bright and clear on the recording, was a ghost. She was gone. He was standing alone in the center of his cold, silent fortress, the king of a kingdom of ashes. A week after the funeral, Miles was a ghost in his own life. He moved through the required meetings and legal proceedings in a numb, detached haze. The empire was his, a vast and complex machine now under his sole command, but the victory tasted like ash in his mouth. The penthouse, once a symbol of his success, was now a monument to his failure, its silence amplifying the echo of her absence. He was in his grandfather's study at the mansion. a room he had avoided until now. He was sorting through personal effects with his family's lawyer when the man handed him a thick, sealed envelope. Arthur left specific instructions that you were to receive this, and only this, after everything else was settled, the lawyer said gently. The envelope was addressed to him in his grandfather's spidery yet forceful handwriting. With a sense of dread, Miles broke the seal. Inside was a short, handwritten letter. My son, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and the company is yours. I hope you have the sense to keep it. But that is not why I am writing. I knew about your contract with the girl from the very beginning. A private investigator is a useful tool. I saw the payments. I read the clauses. The words hit Miles like a physical blow. His grandfather had known. The entire test, the final question. It had all been a deliberate, calculated charade on Arthur's part. I let it continue because I also saw the truth. I saw the way you looked at her when you thought no one was watching. I saw the way she stood by you, not as an employee, but as a partner. Your ridiculous rule about love. Your grandmother would have laughed in your face. She was the biggest risk I ever took, and the only one that ever truly mattered. Love is not a liability to be managed, you foolish boy. It is the only thing worth the risk. Miles's hands trembled as he continued to read. I have enclosed something else. It is a letter the girl wrote to her sister. It was never sent. I took the liberty of intercepting it. Read it. And please learn from the mistakes of an old man before it is too late. Tucked behind his grandfather's letter was a second, smaller envelope. It was addressed to Lily. With a heart full of dread and a sliver of desperate hope, Miles unfolded the single sheet of paper inside. It was April's handwriting, elegant and familiar. Dearest Lily, I don't know how to explain what's happening. I'm living in a fairy tale, but none of it is real. Or the parts that are real are the parts I'm not allowed to have. I've fallen in love with him. It's not a crush, not like anything I've ever felt before. It's this deep, aching, terrifying thing that fills up every part of me. I love him so much, Lily, that it physically hurts to keep it inside, but I can never tell him. It's the one thing he's forbidden me from doing. It's the price I have to pay to see him safe, to help him win this war he's fighting. So I'll play my part. I'll stand by him, and I'll lie with my silence. I'll help him win his kingdom, even if it means I can never be a part of it. I just wish he could see that my love isn't a threat. It's the truest thing I have to offer. The letter fell from his nerveless fingers. The truth of it, the sheer, selfless power of her love, crashed over him. She hadn't been playing a part for money. She had been sacrificing her own heart for his sake. His carefully constructed walls, the fortress of logic and fear he had built around himself for years, didn't just crack. They crumbled into dust. He sank into his grandfather's leather chair, the enormity of his foolishness crushing him. And for the first time since he was a boy, Miles Whitmore wept. He had been so afraid of a counterfeit emotion that he had been completely blind to the priceless, genuine love offered freely to him, and he had thrown it all away. He knew, with a sudden, soul-deep clarity, what he had to do. The grief that had paralyzed Miles transformed into a singular, desperate purpose. Find her. It was the only thought in his mind, the only command his heart would obey. He started where their two worlds had first collided, the diner. He walked in during the mid-morning lull, the smell of coffee and frying bacon a stark contrast to the sterile air of his corporate life. He sat at the counter, in the same worn vinyl stool where he had watched her for weeks, falling for her long before he even knew her name. The owner, a kind middle-aged woman named Maria, recognized him instantly. "Mr. Whitmore, haven't seen you in a while. Looking for April?" "Yes," Miles said, his voice raw. "Do you know where she is? It's important." Maria's friendly expression tightened. "She quit. Said she was leaving the city for a while. Didn't say where." She looked at him, her eyes shrewd. "She was a good kid, a bright light. I hope you didn't have anything to do with that light going out." The gentle rebuke hit him harder than any corporate attack. He left the diner with a new sense of urgency. He drove to her old apartment building, a place that now seemed to hold the ghost of their late-night conversations. He spoke to the landlord, who only knew that she had paid her final month's rent and turned in her keys. He went to the university, hoping she might have contacted her sister, but privacy policies were a wall he couldn't break through, even with his name. Every lead was a dead end. Every closed door was a fresh wave of panic. It was as if she had vanished from the face of the earth, taking the color and warmth of his world with her. The city, his city, felt vast and empty without her in it. For the first time, he felt the true, terrifying scope of what it meant to lose her. She wasn't just gone from his penthouse, she was gone from his universe. He was back in his car, parked on a random street, the city lights blurring through the rain-streaked windshield, when a memory surfaced. It was a fragment of a conversation from one of their quiet evenings, a story she had told him about her childhood. "My grandmother was my favorite person in the world," she had said, a soft, nostalgic smile on her face. "She lived in this tiny little house in a coastal town a few hours from here. It always smelled of salt and roses. It was my happy place." It was a long shot, a desperate, flimsy thread of hope. He didn't have a town name, only a vague direction, but it was all he had left. He pulled out his laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating his determined face. He was a man who commanded a global network of information. He began a methodical, relentless search, cross-referencing property records with her family names, searching for any connection to a small coastal town. It took hours. The rain stopped, and the first pale light of dawn was beginning to streak the sky when he finally found it. A single property tax record under her grandmother's name in a town he'd never heard of, Port Blossom. He didn't hesitate. He didn't sleep. He put the address into his GPS and drove, his heart pounding with a mixture of wild hope and sheer terror. Hours later, he arrived. Port Blossom was exactly as she had described it, a quaint, sleepy town where the air tasted of salt. He followed the winding coastal road until he found the address. It was a small, charming cottage, painted a cheerful shade of blue, with a wild, beautiful garden overflowing with roses. And there, on the front porch, which overlooked the gray, churning sea, was a figure. A woman, her back to him, stood before an easel, a paintbrush in her hand. Her hair, the same shade of warm honey he knew so well, was tied back in a messy bun, and she was wearing an old, paint-splattered sweater. It was her. His heart stopped. He got out of the car, his legs feeling unsteady. He had crossed the country, moved mountains of data, chased a ghost, and he had found her. He stood at the edge of the garden path, the sound of the waves crashing on the shore the only noise. What could he possibly say that would be enough? The crunch of his expensive leather shoes on the gravel path was a sound that did not belong in this quiet seaside world. April froze, her paintbrush hovering over the canvas. She turned slowly, her body tensing as if bracing for a blow. When she saw him, her eyes widened in disbelief. He looked nothing like the powerful CEO or the polished billionaire. He looked undone. His hair was a mess, his expensive clothes were rumpled from the long drive, and a dark stubble shadowed his jaw. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. They were filled with a raw, desperate exhaustion and a vulnerability she had never seen before. "Miles?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of the waves. What are you doing here?" He walked toward her, his steps slow, hesitant. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps, looking up at her as if she were a mirage he was afraid might vanish. "I was a fool," he said, his voice hoarse, broken, a blind, arrogant fool. He took a step up, then another, until he was standing on the porch with her, the space between them charged with a year's worth of unspoken words. "My grandfather. He taught me how to build an empire, how to protect a legacy, how to manage risk," he continued, his gaze locked on hers. "But you tried to teach me what actually mattered, and I was too afraid to listen. I suffocated you. I suffocated us with my rules, with my fear." He reached out, not to touch her, but as if to simply bridge the gap between them with the gesture. "That rule, he said, his voice thick with self-loathing. That stupid, cowardly rule. It was never about you. It was always about me. It was a wall I built to protect myself from a ghost, from a memory of a love that was conditional. And in the process, I walled out the only real, unconditional thing that has ever happened to me. He took a deep, shuddering breath, gathering all his courage for the final, terrifying leap. His eyes, now glistening with unshed tears, held hers. "I love you, April," he said, the forbidden words finally spoken, breaking his own sacred rule. They tumbled out of him, raw and unfiltered, a torrent of truth held back for far too long. "I love you, and it terrifies me. But the thought of living one more day in a world without you in it, that is infinitely worse." The confession hung in the salt-laced air between them, stunning and absolute. He had said it. He had broken his own law. He had offered her his heart, stripped of all its armor, with no clauses, no conditions, no escape hatches. April stared at him, silent and still, as tears began to stream down her own face. He had crossed the country, torn down his own walls, and shattered his own rules, all for her. The choice, now and forever, was hers. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, April just stood there, the tears on her cheeks mingling with the salty sea spray. The sound of his confession, the 3 words she had ached to hear and been forbidden to say, echoed in the space between them. Then a sound bubbled up from her chest. It was a laugh. A wet, choked, beautiful laugh of pure, unadulterated relief. She dropped her paintbrush, not caring as it clattered onto the wooden porch boards, and launched herself into his arms. "I love you too, you idiot," she sobbed against his chest, her arms wrapping around his neck as if she would never let go. "I love you so much it hurt to keep it inside." He crushed her to him, his face buried in her hair, a ragged, shuddering sigh of relief escaping him. It was not a kiss of passion, but an embrace of homecoming. It was 2 fractured souls, finally fitting back together. After a long moment, he pulled back slightly, his hands framing her face. He looked at her, truly looked at her, his eyes full of an adoration so profound it made her feel like the most precious thing in the world. "The contract was terminated the moment you left," he said softly, his voice still thick with emotion. "The money, all of it, is yours, unconditionally. It was transferred to a trust in your name that I can't touch. But I hope you know, it was never about that." "I know," she whispered, her hand coming up to rest on his heart, feeling its steady, relieved beat. "For me either." A small, hesitant smile touched his lips. "I brought you something," he said, his voice suddenly a little shaky. He stepped back, but only a foot, never breaking their connection. The vast, endless ocean served as the backdrop to their small, intimate stage. He reached into the pocket of his rumpled jacket and pulled out a small velvet box. It was old, the edges worn smooth with time. "My grandfather left this for me," he explained, his gaze never leaving hers. "He said it belonged to my grandmother. He told me he was keeping it for the day I finally found the woman who would make me understand that love isn't a clause to be managed, but the entire reason for everything." He opened the box. Inside, nestled on faded silk, was an antique engagement ring. It was a simple, timeless design, a single sparkling diamond flanked by 2 small sapphires the color of the sea. It wasn't a billionaire's trophy. It was a story, a legacy of real love. Then, on the weathered wooden planks of the porch, with the sound of the waves as his witness, Miles Whitmore got down on one knee. "I don't have a new contract," he said, his voice trembling slightly as he looked up at her, his heart bare in his eyes. "I only have a promise, a vow, to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of the love you were willing to give me even when I was too afraid to accept it." "April Collins," he asked, his voice breaking on her name, "will you do me the honor of being my wife?" Her tears were flowing freely now, but they were tears of pure, blinding joy. She couldn't form a word, so she just nodded frantically, laughing and crying all at once. "Yes," she finally managed to whisper. Yes, 1,000 times, yes. He slid the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. He stood up, pulling her into his arms, and kissed her. It was a kiss that sealed not a deal, but a destiny. The story that had begun with a desperate lie in a crowded ballroom, a story governed by a clause born of fear, had found its end and its new beginning here, on a quiet porch by the sea, with a promise that had no rules, only love.